Have you ever node-locked a sim using GTO Wizard AI and then been confused or surprised by the results? If you have, this video is for you. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and today we're going to be talking about what the pros know about node locking that you don't. Very interesting topic, so let's dive right in. First and foremost, let's answer the question, what is node locking? Well, node locking is telling the solver what to do instead of letting it decide. A node obviously refers to a specific point in the decision tree throughout the hand, and locking refers to forcing the solver to do a specific thing with a certain hand, or a set of hands, or in fact the entire range. Node locking can teach us how to respond against a specific strategy, which we're basing on assumptions about how our opponents will play, as opposed to the solver telling us how to formulate an optimal strategy where we don't know how our opponent's going to play. Now, the most important thing to remember about node locking, and something that any pro or anybody who's spent a long time working with solvers definitely recognizes, is that everything affects everything else. So what I mean by that is that changing one thing is going to change the entire sim. And that's because it's kind of an ecosystem all to itself. Everything depends on everything else. If you alter one bet size, if you lock a specific range, if you tweak a frequency, all of these things are going to affect each other. And of course, that also means that altering one player's strategy is going to affect the other player's strategy, because that's the point. That's the goal. We're trying to see what impact it has when we change one strategy and see how the other one alters to counter it. If we want to isolate a specific variable, we have to account for this. We have to account for the fact that everything depends on everything else. But this can sometimes backfire. So we always have to strike this balance of incorporating the elements about which we have some degree of confidence and not going too far and making specific assumptions about very nuanced aspects of our opponent's strategy where we may not actually have a lot of clarity in practice. So that's the first and the most important thing here to remember. It's that a sim is an ecosystem as a whole, and everything affects everything else. So you should expect to see multiple things change, even if you change one small variable. The second thing to keep in mind is that the solver is always going to compensate for whatever you do. So what I mean by this is that a solver is a max EV calculator. That's all it is. It's calculating the maximum EV strategy based on the variables that you give it. So this means that if you're going to lock the solver in to do a specific thing, it's always going to try as hard as it can to compensate for that in whatever way that it needs to do in order to maximize its EV. It's going to reconfigure its entire strategy to cater to the specific thing that you forced it to do. So it's really important that we account for this when we run locked sims, when we node lock, because it can affect the strategies quite significantly. And I can show you a little example of that here if I flip over to looking at a sim that I built in GTO Wizard AI. So this is a fairly straightforward spot here. It's a 100 big blind cash game chip EV scenario. We open in the hijack, get called from the big blind, and we go to a flop of king 7 deuce. So very straightforward situation. And as you can see, the solver likes a range bet here. The solver does prefer the 100% bet frequency with this 20% size based on the game tree that I've given it. But what if I say that I want to check back pocket kings, if I want to check back top set here? And I'm not going to make any other assumptions beyond that. I'm going to say, I just want to force the solver to check back pocket kings. Well, we go into node locking and we say set strategy, check, and then we say pocket kings, always checks. And we're not going to lock anything else. We're not going to hit either of these buttons. We're just going to lock pocket kings. That's the only assumption we're making here. So we're going to hit node lock, and as you'll see, there's a bunch of other hands checking now as well. The fact that we checked pocket kings caused us to suddenly start checking a bunch of other hands as well. Well, why is this? The answer is that the solver is never going to be satisfied with a strategy where pocket kings is the only hand that we check back in this situation, because that's incredibly exploitable. If we check this flop and we always have kings, our opponent isn't going to put another chip into the pot. unless they have a draw that's live against kings. So in the end, it actually forces us to start checking back some other hands. And based on the variable that we locked, which is that we have to check back pocket kings, this is now the best strategy. You can see that it involves checking a diverse range of hands, even some ace highs, some queen high, some low pocket pairs. All sorts of hands here are included in this range, because if we're going to have any checking range at all, it needs to be a well-rounded checking range. It can't just be pocket kings. And we could do the same thing here with any other hand. If I picked one individual hand and forced us to check back with that hand, the solver would formulate a range around that is designed to maximize the EV of that range in this spot. It's never going to be satisfied with just a suboptimal range of only one value hand. So it's going to compensate for whatever you do. The second thing that we have to bear in mind when it comes to node locking is that any suboptimal line is going to be attacked by the solver. So it's going to really target any weakness that it can find. Even a small weakness in a player's strategy at a specific node is going to be targeted by the solver. So for example, if two bet sizes are very close together in size, but one of them produces a suboptimal response, the solver is going to gravitate directly towards that size. As the bet sizes become more different, of course, that's likely to create some different variables because we're dealing with a different type of price altogether. But let's say two bet sizes are close together and one of them is producing mistakes. Well, that's the size the solver is going to pick. And the more our opponent deviates away from a GTO strategy, the more the solver is going to gravitate towards this option. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here we have our same spot that we just looked at, except this time I have added a 40% bet size as well as the 20%. In this case, you can see that the solver is basically splitting pretty evenly between the two. Seems like it doesn't really mind which size we use. It's mixing both options, and there isn't really any specific adaptation that we have to make to our sizing here. But what happens if I say, well, I think my opponent is going to respond suboptimally to this 40% size. I'm going to lock them to never continue with ace high against 40%. So I'm going to say fold 100 with all their ace highs. And we're just going to lock that in place. Now, I am going to lock the rest of the range because, as I said, if we don't, it's going to compensate. The solver is going to compensate for the fact that we forced them to fold ace high. So what we want is we want them to continue playing the rest of their range the same, but also fold ace high. So I'm going to hit lock all here. And then we go node lock down the bottom right. And as you'll now see, our sim is going to gravitate towards that 40% size. 96% using the 40% size now instead of the 20%. Clearly, what it's doing is targeting that weakness that's coming from villain folding ace high every time here. Now, it's not even a massive weakness because a lot of the ace high was folding to 40% anyway. But even just by creating a small weakness at this specific node of the tree, we've created something that the in-position player can attack, and the solver has gravitated immediately towards that. So when you look at any one node, any one bet sizing to which your opponent is responding suboptimally, that's where the solver is going to go. Our next point of interest here is that the overall game tree matters a lot more than you might think. And restricting options in the game tree has a similar effect to node locking in many cases. For example, if the solver's preferred size isn't included within the game tree that you use for your solution, it can warp the strategy beyond all recognition. And it can also warp the other player's strategy. And this is particularly true for raise sizes facing a bet. If you only allow your opponent to raise to a specific size, it's quite often going to influence the range of hands it's going to bet in the first place. The frequency at which a bet gets raised will heavily influence the EV of the bet, and the frequency of raises is going to be heavily dependent on the size of the raise. So when you change the size of the raise, you alter a bunch of different factors that are going to influence how much EV the player can get out of a bet in the first place. Let me show you what I mean. So this is our same scenario as earlier, except it's a different board texture. We've got the queen 8-6 with a flush draw here. And in this case, you can see the sim wants to bet about 60% of the time, approximately. And we're facing a raise to 4x the bet, so a 2/3 pot raise here with about 12% frequency. But what if I say, well, I think my opponent is only going to raise all in here. They're not going to ever raise to 2/3 pot. Well, clearly that's a big mistake. an all-in raise is 963% of pot here. It's ridiculous. The sim doesn't actually want to do it at all. If I say the only raise size you're allowed is all in, well, it's better to just play call or fold than to play a strategy with all ins here. And because of this, because the solver has now decided that all in is worse than just call or fold, it's also going to affect the betting range. And it now becomes a range bet for this 40% size for the in position player. So as you can see, changing the size of the raise altered the betting strategy substantially. And if I did something a little bit in between, so if I, for example, only allow an overbet raise, so 133% of pot, not necessarily a ridiculous size, but definitely a very big one, we'll see another change in the strategy once again here. It's probably going to include at least some raising here, but it's a very, very big raise, and it's only coming in at 10% frequency, and you can see the betting frequency is now back to about 65%. So in fact, it's gone a little bit closer to equilibrium here. It's gone back closer to that 62-ish% region that it was in before, which is interesting because it's showing us that 133%, even though it's too big of a raise, it's still realistic and reasonable enough that it's going to allow it to come in at a 10% frequency compared to the all-in, which was just outrageously big. And that definitely altered the in-position player's options quite a bit here. So the game tree itself, and not just the locking, influences things a lot. The next thing we have to remember here is that it's a 3-street game that we're playing. Node locking doesn't end on the flop. When you lock a flop sim, you should be very confident that you're noting and being mindful of how that influences the subsequent streets. Because if your opponent overfolds or underfolds the flop, it's going to drastically alter the way that the turn and potentially even the river play out. And similarly, defending against a value-heavy flop strategy, so a player who's under-bluffing the flop dramatically, can produce a lot of really weird turn scenarios because it alters the range of hands that you're continuing with, and then it alters the way that the turn is going to interact, and so on and so forth. So remember that node locking doesn't end on one street. It affects the way the game tree is going to pan out across all of the post-flop streets that exist. Let's look at a brief example of that. So here we are back on our King 7 Deuce flop, and this time I've gone with a 40% size here. You can see it still wants to range bet, so nothing really changing there. And I'm going to do the same thing again that I did before, which is to lock villain to never call the flop with ace high, and we're just going to go with that. Now they are calling with some other backdoor type stuff, but for now we won't worry too much about that because the turn that we're going to look at is specifically an ace. So in this case, we're going to look at the ace of spades turn. And as you can see, the turn frequency for aggression here is very high. The in-position player is able to barrel this turn for 86% pot about 3/4 of the time, or slightly more than that, because villain doesn't have ace high in their check calling range, and therefore they don't turn an ace pretty much ever. So with that said, how does this compare to the original sim? Well, if I was to go back and unlock it and take a look at what was happening to begin with, well, if our opponent does call their ace highs, now our frequency for betting this turn is only 57%. So even though the sizing hasn't changed, the overall frequency that we're betting has changed substantially. Our capacity for aggression has altered, and you'll see plenty of other situations where the turn sizing will change if you plug in a more dramatic overfold or even an underfold, for example. So it's really important to note that what you do on the flop with your node lock is going to have an impact going through the streets. And if you play the turn the same way against a tighter range or a wider range, you might be making some mistakes. So you have to be mindful that the turn is going to be altered every time you alter the flop. Now, our next concept to remember here is don't lock too many things at once. If you lock every aspect of your opponent's strategy, you're going to get an extreme max exploit as the response. And the problem with this is that it's unrealistic to think that you do actually know every single aspect of your opponent's strategy. It's really, really rare you can find players that you know exactly what they're going to do with every hand at every node on a certain street. It can give you a max exploit, but it's very unlikely this is going to be an accurate representation of reality. And it's quite easy to go too far in the wrong direction and end up producing a strategy that's so heavily exploitative that even going a slight bit wrong can drastically alter your EV and really result in you being the one who gets exploited instead of them. So what it comes down to is the locking that you do should reflect the confidence level that you have in various different aspects of your opponent's overall strategy. And I can show you an example of that right here. So here we are back in our previous spot, and this time we're back on that Queen 8-6 flush draw board. You can see our c-bet frequency is back in this 62% or so region like we saw before. We're supposed to be facing a 2/3 pot raise here, 4x the bet, and you can see it's supposed to come in about 12% of the time. Now, there's different kinds of ways that we can node lock here and get an idea of how our response alters. We can say, okay, well, what happens if my opponent is simply doing a certain thing at a different frequency to what they're supposed to? So maybe I can say, okay, well, they're going to raise about 20% of the time instead of 12% of the time. If I lock this strategy in place and then we look for what our response is going to look like or how our strategy is going to be altering, we can see that that 62% has now gone down to about 56%. So clearly, when we're getting raised more often, we're c-betting less often. But what if I want to keep this strategy in place, but I also want to say, well, I'm pretty confident that there's very specific hands that they're always going to raise. So I'm going to hit node lock again, and this time I'm going to go to set strategy, and I'm going to say, well, I think they're always going to raise their sets and their 2 pairs, and I think they're always going to raise their combo draws, but I also think they are not going to raise second pair or third pair. They're never going to raise an 8 or a 6. And we're pretty confident that they're actually just going to fold these low pocket pairs right here. So we're going to get rid of those. And maybe I think that they would be more inclined to just call when they just have a gut shot as opposed to raising. So maybe I'm just going to have them just call with their gut shots right there. So we've now got a different kind of a range for them here. We altered the frequency to begin with. We upped the frequency, but then we said, well, the frequency might be a bit higher, but it's not going to come from these types of hands necessarily. It's going to come from more draws. It's going to come from more value combos. So now we have 2 different factors combined to give us a sense of how this opponent is playing. And if we hit lock now, we've got every combo locked in, but we've done it in a couple of different ways, and we can combine these together to get a sense of where our response is potentially going to go. So, as you can see, our c-bet frequency now goes back up to 72% or so. So we've actually got to a point where even though they were originally raising more than normal, in fact, they still are 15% instead of 12%, they actually are raising more often than normal. They're doing it in a way that we still are able to actually c-bet more often. And we are continuing in a little bit more of a tighter fashion here because we're folding more than half the time to this raise, which is reflective of the fact that this raise comes from a range that's pretty heavy on value and a lot of good draws. So overall here, we've combined a couple of different types of node locking to account for the things that we're confident about, less confident about, and so on. And we've come up with a pretty good response as a result. Now, finally, the last thing I want to talk about here is that your goal when you're doing a node lock or when you're studying node lock solutions is not to learn a specific strategy. It's really to understand the relationships between the different variables that the solver is considering and learn how they affect your strategy. And if you can develop a broad knowledge of how certain specific tendencies that our opponent might have are going to influence our exploitative approaches, you can start to exploit on the fly without having to prepare each individual spot. And this really is how elite players, how pros are going to be able to adapt to their opposition without the need for detailed info or quote-unquote reads. It's not about adapting to specific individual opponents. It's about understanding the average tendencies of the players you're up against, recognizing what variables are going to be affecting your strategy in one direction or another, and being able to adapt based on those variables. And node locking is going to help you get a long way to that point. What it's not going to do is give you strategies that you can just learn and repeat over and over again. So that's something to keep in mind. With that said, that's it for this video. If you want to watch another video, check out this one that I made recently called The Truth About Mixed Strategies. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll be back soon with another video. Until then, good luck, wizards.